She was standing at the middle of a bridal boutique in downtown Chicago when her older sister looked her up and down, laughed, and said the thing that broke something loose inside her chest, something that had been cracking for years. The dress wouldn't zip. Zuri Bennett already knew that. She had known it the moment she slid the gown off the hanger, known it the way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes color. But she tried anyway because Naomi had asked her to, and Zuri had spent 28 years trying for Naomi. That was her first mistake of the day. It would not be her last. She hadn't wanted to come. That morning, Zuri had stood in her apartment on the south side, staring at her reflection in the foggy bathroom mirror with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in late October. The wind off the lake cut straight through fabric and muscle and found the bone. And the sky had that flat gray color that meant the cold wasn't going anywhere soon. She'd already pulled on her good jeans, her good boots, the burgundy sweater Naomi had told her made her look put together. She had done her edges. She had put on the small gold hoops their mother had left behind. She had done everything right. She did everything right. She always did everything right. Her phone buzzed. Naomi's name lit up the screen. "You're not backing out. I swear to God, Zuri, if you bail on me today..." She picked up before the message finished. "I'm coming," she said. "Good. Because I need someone real with me today, not just my girlfriends who are going to tell me everything looks amazing." A pause. "Wear something that photographs well." Zuri looked at the burgundy sweater. "I'm already dressed." "The burgundy? No. Wear the cream blouse. The cream blouse makes me look, it photographs better, trust me." She changed into the cream blouse. That was mistake number 2. The boutique was called Aria Bridal, and it sat on Michigan Avenue like it had always belonged there. Tall windows, white curtains backlit from the inside, the kind of storefront that made you feel underdressed just walking past it. Naomi had booked the entire Saturday morning appointment 3 months ago, which meant there were 4 of her girlfriends already inside when Zuri pushed through the glass door, all of them holding champagne flutes and talking too loud over a speaker playing something instrumental in French. Naomi herself was already in the fitting area, standing on a low pedestal in a strapless silk gown that cost more than Zuri's monthly rent. She looked, objectively, stunning. High cheekbones, long neck, the kind of figure that made dresses look like they'd been designed specifically for her body. Naomi Bennett had always been the one people saw first in a room. Zuri had learned to accept that a long time ago, or at least she had learned to act like she had. "There she is," Naomi said, raising her champagne glass. "My little sister, fashionably late. I'm 4 minutes late. The parking... Come look at this dress. Tell me what you think." Zuri crossed the room, set her bag down on a velvet chair, and looked. The gown caught light like water. The seaming was perfect. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "Right?" Naomi turned side to side in the mirror. "Marcus is going to lose his mind." One of Naomi's girlfriends, Keisha, the one with the long acrylic nails, pressed a champagne flute into Zuri's hand. Zuri took it, but didn't drink. It was 10:15 in the morning. The boutique consultant, a thin white woman named Daphne, who wore her hair in a low chignon and spoke in a tone that suggested she had been trained to make everyone feel slightly inferior, materialized at Zuri's elbow. "Are you the maid of honor?" "Sister," Zuri said. "Wonderful. We have some bridesmaid styles you might want to try while your sister finishes her selection. We have gorgeous options in every silhouette." There was something in the way Daphne said every silhouette, a slight emphasis, a practiced neutrality, that told Zuri exactly what kind of conversation this was going to be. "I'm just here to support," Zuri said. Rishad. "Oh, but you should try something on. It'll be fun." Naomi stepped down from the pedestal and looped her arm through Zuri's, steering her toward the rack of bridesmaid samples. Her grip was affectionate but firm, the way it had always been, the way that made it impossible to pull back without making a scene. "Try the burgundy one. You love burgundy." "You told me not to wear burgundy today." "On you in a dress it'll look different. Come on, you never try anything on." Zuri knew what was happening. She had watched this pattern play out her entire life. Naomi would invite her into something, Zuri would resist, Naomi would push, and Zuri would eventually surrender because the energy required to hold the line against her sister was more than Zuri could afford to spend on a Saturday morning. And then whatever happened next would be framed as Zuri's choice, Zuri's idea, Zuri's problem. But she tried the dress. Daphne disappeared behind the curtain to assist, and Zuri stood in the dressing room in her bra and the cream blouse she hadn't wanted to wear, and she stepped into the sample gown, and Daphne pulled the zipper up as far as it would go, which was about 4 inches below the point where it needed to close. Silence. Then Daphne said, very carefully, "We can absolutely order this in your size." "How much of a size difference are we looking at?" Naomi's voice from just outside the curtain. Daphne hesitated. "Naomi," Zuri said quietly. But Naomi had already pulled the curtain back. Not all the way. Just enough to look. The way someone opens a door to a room they know they shouldn't enter and then claims they didn't really go inside. Her eyes went to the unzipped back of the dress, to the gap of fabric, to the 4 inches of zipper that hadn't closed. And then she laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, technically. That was the thing about Naomi Beck. Her cruelty never looked like cruelty from the outside. It was the kind of laugh that could be explained away as nervousness, as affection, as sisters being sisters if anyone questioned it afterward. Light, involuntary, quick. The laugh of someone who found something funny and simply couldn't help themselves. But it carried. In the small boutique, with its hardwood floors and its high ceilings and its carefully curated acoustics, Naomi's laugh carried to Keisha and the other girlfriends standing near the champagne, and Keisha turned to look, and one of the other women, Jade, the one Zuri had always liked the least, covered her mouth with her hand in that exaggerated way that was worse than laughing openly, and the moment stretched like something being slowly torn apart. "Okay," Naomi said, waving her hand. "We'll order it in the right size. It's fine." She let the curtain fall back. Zuri stood in the 3/4 zipped dress in the dressing room and looked at herself in the mirror and breathed through her nose and told herself she was not going to cry. She was not going to cry in a boutique dressing room on Michigan Avenue over a bridesmaid dress that didn't fit, because that was not who she was. That was not who she was going to be today. She was 28 years old, and she had survived worse than this. She breathed. She folded the feeling down into the tight place in her chest where she kept all the other feelings she couldn't afford to have in public, and she changed back into her cream blouse and her good jeans and her good boots, and she walked back out into the boutique holding her shoulders straight. Keisha was talking about floral arrangements. Naomi was back on the pedestal. Daphne was producing a second gown from a rack in the back. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody ever mentioned it. That was the rule. Zuri sat down in the velvet chair and picked up the champagne flute she'd left there and finally took a sip. And it was warm and slightly flat, and it tasted like exactly the kind of morning she was having. She almost missed him entirely. There were other customers in the boutique, a mother and daughter near the front. The daughter young enough that the veil she was trying on looked like something from a costume, her mother filming everything on her phone. A couple in the corner who were clearly arguing about something in whispered Italian. A man sitting alone near the window turned slightly away from the room, scrolling through his phone. Zuri noticed him the way you notice something slightly wrong in a familiar room. Not immediately, but as an accumulation of small observations. He was too still for someone sitting in a bridal boutique alone. He was dressed like he'd come from somewhere else and hadn't bothered to change. Dark slacks, a charcoal button-down with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, a watch on his left wrist that caught light the way expensive things do. Korean, she guessed, somewhere in his mid-30s, with the kind of face that was composed by default rather than effort, the face of someone who had learned to keep his expression neutral so long it had become his actual expression. What she noticed most was that he wasn't looking at his phone. He was looking at her. Not the way men looked at women they found attractive. Not that slow, assessing sweep that she'd learned to deflect before the eye contact could fully form. He was looking at her the way you look at something you're trying to understand. Focused, careful, like she was a problem he was working through without quite having enough information yet. Their eyes met. Zuri looked away first. She always looked away first. But the warmth that moved up the back of her neck told her that when she looked back, and she would look back, because she was only human, he would still be watching. She didn't look back. Instead, she focused on Naomi stepping into gown number 2, which had lace sleeves and a cathedral train and required 3 people to arrange properly, and Zuri did the thing she was good at, which was being present in the room without actually being in the room, which was watching other people's lives from a careful, maintained distance while keeping her own feelings tucked where they couldn't be reached. She was very good at that. She had been practicing since she was 7 years old. The man left before Naomi had finished trying on her 4th gown. Zuri knew because she tracked his movement through the boutique in her peripheral vision without meaning to. The way he stood, unhurried, the way he buttoned his jacket cuff before putting his phone in his pocket, the way he spoke briefly to Daphne near the door in a tone too low to hear, and then walked out without looking back at any of them, without looking back at her, which was the correct and expected outcome. And Zuri told herself she was not disappointed, because she had not been hoping for anything. She had simply noticed a stranger in a room the way anyone would, and now he was gone. And that was the end of it. Naomi chose a gown at noon, ivory, fitted through the hips, simple enough to let her face do the work. It was the right choice. Naomi always made the right choice about things like this. In the car on the way back, with Naomi driving and the heat blasting and the Chicago skyline receding in the rearview mirror, Naomi said, "You were quiet today." "I'm usually quiet. More than usual." Naomi glanced at her sideways. "You're not still upset about the dress thing, are you?" Zuri looked out the window at Lakeshore Drive, at the gray water and the gray sky, and the way they met at the horizon in a line you couldn't quite see. "No," she said, "because it wasn't a big deal. Samples run small. Daphne said they run small." "I know. I just laughed because it was—" Naomi paused, searching. "It was just a moment. You know how I am." Zuri knew exactly how she was. "It's fine," she said. Naomi nodded, satisfied, and turned up the radio, and they drove the rest of the way south in the kind of silence that passes for peace when you've stopped expecting the real thing. 7 days later, Zuri was carrying a folding table across the gymnasium floor of the Korean Community Center on the north side when someone took the other end. She startled. "I've got it," she said before she turned to look. "I can see that," the man said. "I'm just offering." She turned. It was him. Same dark slacks, different shirt, cream this time, open at the collar, and the same watch, and the same composed expression that didn't quite qualify as a smile, but wasn't its absence either. He was holding his end of the table with one hand, easy and unbothered, waiting. Zuri's brain ran through a quick series of calculations that it immediately tried to disguise as normal thought. "You were at Aria Bridal," she said. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "You noticed. You were the only man sitting alone. It wasn't hard to notice." "Fair." He tilted his head toward the far wall. "Where does this go?" She carried her end. He carried his. They set the table down against the wall where the volunteer coordinator, a woman named Helen who had been running this event for 9 consecutive years and moved through the space like a general, had indicated. "I don't think I've seen you volunteer here before," Zuri said, which was a statement that also functioned as a question. "I don't volunteer." She looked at him. "I'm an attendee," he said. "Attendees don't usually help set up." "You look like you could use help." He said it simply, without charm or deflection, the way someone states a fact about weather. "Kangji Tai." He extended his hand. She took it. Zuri Bennett. His grip was firm but not performative. The handshake of someone who didn't need to prove anything through a handshake, which in her experience was unusual. "You volunteer here every year, Matt?" he asked. 6 years. You're... She stopped. Recalibrated. "What brought you to the gala?" He considered the question for a moment longer than the question technically required. "I support some of the community programs this organization runs. Tonight felt like a good time to see them in person." There was something in that answer that was technically complete and simultaneously incomplete, the way certain doors look closed but aren't actually latched. Zuri decided not to push on it. "Helen's going to need those chairs moved next," she said, nodding toward the stack near the stage. He looked at the chairs, then back at her. "Then I suppose we should move them, Mom." The gala officially began at 7, but Zuri had been there since 4 in the afternoon, running extension cords and arranging centerpieces and arguing with the catering company about where they could and could not park their van, and by the time the first guests arrived and the lights were lowered and the space transformed into something that actually resembled a celebration. She was tired in the specific, satisfying way you get when you've done something real with your hands. She was standing near the lantern display. Rows of paper lanterns in gold and white strung from the ceiling, a design that one of the Korean-American student groups had spent 2 weeks building, when Jitae appeared beside her with 2 cups of tea. "Chrysanthemum," he said, offering one. "If you drink too much of that champagne, you'll be useless by 9. She took it. "How do you know I've been drinking the champagne?" You've taken 2 glasses from passing trays in the last hour and put them down on every flat surface except your own hands. She stared at him. I'm observant, he said. That's one word for it. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a crease at the corner of his mouth, but it was there. They stood in the light of the lanterns and drank their tea, and somewhere in the distance a string quartet was playing something she recognized but couldn't name, and the room was filling with people in good clothes speaking in 2 languages and the occasional elegant mixture of both. And Zuri thought for a moment that this was one of the most beautiful things she had seen in a long time, and that she almost hadn't come because she'd been tired and the drive was long, and she had 7 unread emails from her department head waiting at home. What do you do? Jite asked. Social work. Family Services Department, Cook County. She wrapped both hands around the teacup. You? Business. What kind of business? He looked at her with that same expression, measured, present, like she had his full attention and he wasn't giving it away for free. Several kinds. That's a very politician answer. Is it? Men who say business without the kind usually mean one of 3 things. Either they're embarrassed by it, or they're protecting it, or they want to seem more interesting than they are. Something passed across his face. Not offense, but a kind of recalibration, like she'd said something he hadn't expected to be said in precisely that way. What do you think I mean? She studied him. I think you're protecting it. A beat of silence. You're direct, he said. People always say that like it's a warning. I meant it as a compliment. She looked at him for a moment, trying to find the performance in it, the polished flattery, the angling, the subtle machinery of a man trying to get something. She'd gotten good at finding it. She found it quickly, usually, and once she found it, she knew exactly how to extract herself from the situation with minimal damage. She couldn't find it. Tell me something true about yourself, she said. Not business, not biography. Something that matters. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer, might deflect or redirect, might do what most people did when she asked that question, which was give her a carefully curated fact designed to sound vulnerable without actually being vulnerable. I haven't slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in 3 years, he said finally. I've stopped noticing it. That concerns me more than the insomnia itself. It was so specific and so unguarded that she didn't know what to do with it for a moment. Why haven't you slept? Because when I'm awake, I'm in control of what happens. He looked down at his tea. When I'm asleep, I'm not. Zuri thought about that. She thought about the tight place in her chest where she kept the feeling she couldn't afford to have in public, about the way she'd stood in that dressing room and breathed through her nose and folded herself smaller, about control as a survival strategy rather than a character trait. Yeah, she said quietly. I understand that. He looked at her. Really looked at her, the way he'd looked at her in the boutique, like she was a problem he was working through, except now she thought maybe she'd been reading that expression wrong. Maybe it wasn't a problem. Maybe it was just the face of someone who wasn't used to being surprised. Tell me something true about yourself, he said. She looked up at the lanterns. I spent this morning talking myself into coming here. I almost didn't. I was going to email Helen and say I had a conflict. She paused. I do that. I almost don't do things, and then I do them anyway, and they turn out to be the best part of the day. And has this been? She looked at him. The best part, he said. She should have deflected. She was good at deflecting. She had an entire vocabulary of deflections, light and well-practiced, which she kept ready for exactly this kind of moment, the moment when something real was being offered, and the smart, safe thing was to redirect it before it landed. Ask me at the end of the night, she said. He almost smiled again. This time it went a little further. They talked for 3 hours. Not continuously. Helen pulled Zuri away twice for volunteer logistics, and Jitai was approached by several men over the course of the evening who seemed to know him in a way that existed entirely in their body language, rather than their words, the kind of knowing that involved a certain careful posture, a slightly lowered voice, a deference that wasn't about social politeness, but about something older and more serious than that. Zuri noticed it and filed it under protecting it, and didn't ask. They found each other again near the dessert table around 9:30. Green tea mochi, she said, holding one out to him. They're better than they look. He took it. That's usually the case with things worth having. She ate her mochi and thought about the bridal boutique and the cream blouse and the zipper that wouldn't close. and she thought about the 7 unread emails and the parking violation she'd gotten on the drive over, and the fact that it was almost October, and she had no plan for October, no plan for the next quarter, no plan for much of anything beyond the next required task. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You've been asking me personal questions for 3 hours. This one's more personal." He waited. "Were you at that boutique last week buying something, or were you just there?" The pause was shorter than his other pauses. "Accompanying someone." "A woman?" "My aunt." He looked at her sideways. "She's getting remarried, 73 years old." Zuri laughed. A real one, the kind that surprised her when it came out. "Good for her. She seems to think so." There was something in his voice when he talked about his aunt, a warmth that hadn't been in the rest of his conversation, unguarded in a way the rest of him wasn't. "She asked me to carry things. I carried things." "You were the only person in that boutique who looked like they'd rather be somewhere else." "That's true of most places I go." And here, he looked at the room, the lanterns, the mingling crowd, the string quartet packing up their instruments near the stage, Helen directing the cleanup crew with the authority of someone who would still be directing cleanup crews in 20 years and didn't consider that anything other than a privilege. "Here is different," he said. She waited to see if he would explain. "Most places I go, people see me before I arrive," he said. "Whatever they know or think they know about me, it's already in the room. I walk in, and I'm fitting into a shape that's already been cut." He looked at her. "You didn't know the shape." She understood what he was saying and also what he was not saying, and she made the same calculation she'd made earlier about the door that was technically complete and simultaneously incomplete. "And do I know it now?" she asked. "Not entirely. Should I be worried about the parts I don't know?" He was quiet for a moment. She watched something move through his expression, not evasion, but a kind of careful honesty, the look of a man who had decided not to lie but was still choosing which truth to tell. "You should make your own judgment," he said. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a long time. They exchanged numbers in the parking lot at 11:15, standing in the wind off the lake that cut straight through fabric and muscle and found the bone, and Jite held her business card in one hand and looked at it for a moment before putting it in his inside jacket pocket. "Zuri Bennett," he said, like he was confirming something. "That's me." He looked at her. "It's a good name." She walked to her car in the dark and didn't let herself feel anything about it until she was inside with the doors locked and the heat running, and then she sat for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel and let the warmth move through her chest in a way she hadn't felt in longer than she wanted to calculate. She didn't trust it. She'd been here before, or somewhere close enough to hear that the view was the same, and she knew how those stories ended, but she also knew she was going to answer when he called. He called on a Tuesday. Not a text, a call, which she noted, because it was the kind of thing that meant something. She was on her lunch break, eating a sandwich over her keyboard at the Cook County Family Services office, and when her phone lit up with a number she didn't have saved yet, she knew immediately who it was, because who else would it be? She let it ring twice before picking up. "You waited," he said. "I was eating. I called during lunch on purpose. I thought you'd be more likely to pick up if you had an excuse to stop working." She put her sandwich down. "That's very calculated. I'm a calculated person." I noticed. A pause. Then, "Coffee. Thursday. There's a place on Wabash that's quiet enough to actually hear someone talk." She thought about all the reasons this was probably inadvisable. She thought about the shape he'd said she didn't know the full outline of. She thought about Naomi's laugh in the boutique and the tight place in her chest, and the 7 emails she still hadn't answered, and how long it had been since she'd had a conversation with someone who actually surprised her. "Thursday works," she said. The coffee shop on Wabash was in fact quiet enough to hear someone talk, and they stayed for 2 hours, and the following Monday he took her to a place along the river where you could walk, and the wind was not as cutting as it had been the week before, and it was on that walk that she told him about the bridal boutique. She hadn't planned to. It came out sideways, the way things do when you've been holding them for longer than your body can comfortably manage. She'd been talking about Naomi, about the wedding, about the particular exhaustion of being the sister who carried the emotional labor of keeping a relationship alive. And then suddenly she was describing the dressing room and the zipper and the 4 inches and Naomi's laugh, and her voice was steady, because she was very good at keeping her voice steady, but her hands were wrapped tight around her jacket zipper. Jite didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, she laughed in front of people. It wasn't like, in front of people, he said again. Not as a question, as a thing he was making sure he had correct. She didn't mean it to. That doesn't change what it was. Zuri looked at him. He was watching the river, jaw set, and there was something in his expression that wasn't quite anger. It was sharper than that, and quieter, which was in her experience more dangerous than loud anger. You don't have to be upset on my behalf, she said. I'm not upset on your behalf. He turned to look at her. I'm upset because someone hurt you and called it humor, and you're still defending her. She didn't have an answer for that. They walked for another hour, and somewhere in the middle of it the conversation shifted and she learned that he'd grown up in Seoul, in a household where affection was a liability, where his father had believed that anything you loved could be used against you, where Jitai had been told from an age when he was still small enough to carry that emotions were weapons that other people would use if you were foolish enough to display them. He told her this without self-pity, in the same tone he used to describe everything, measured, factual, like he was reporting on someone else's life. But she heard what was underneath it, the way you hear a current underneath water that looks still on the surface. And she thought about all the ways a person could be shaped by what they were told they were not allowed to be. Who taught you to feel things anyway? She asked. He was quiet. Someone did, she said. Otherwise you wouldn't know what you were missing. He looked at her. My aunt, he said. The one getting remarried. Zuri smiled. I like her already. Something happened in his expression. Something she couldn't quite name, something that looked like relief at a frequency too low to be visible, more felt than seen. Like she had said the right thing without knowing there was a right thing to say. She'd like you, he said. She asks too many personal questions. I ask too many personal questions. Yes. She laughed. He watched her laugh the same way he'd watched her in the boutique and in the gala and across every coffee shop table and riverside path they'd walked over the past 3 weeks. With that focused, careful attention that had stopped feeling like assessment and had started feeling like something she didn't have a clean word for yet. The wind came off the river and pushed her hair across her face, and before she could reach up, he did. A brief, careful movement, the back of 2 fingers brushing the hair back from her cheek, not lingering, not making anything of it, just the small, precise action of someone who sees a thing that needs doing and does it. Her breath caught. He pulled his hand back. Sorry, he said. Don't be. They stood there for a second in the particular suspended quality of a moment that has shifted and can't shift back, both of them looking at the river, both of them aware that something had just changed, and neither of them in a position to decide yet what to do about it. Zuri? His voice had changed, lower. Don't, she said softly. I wasn't going to say anything. You were about to say something that means we can't keep doing this the way we've been doing it. He was quiet. I'm not ready for that, she said. Whatever that is, I need more time to... She stopped, rearranged. I just need more time. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and they started walking again, and they talked about other things for the rest of the afternoon. And it was good. It was genuinely good, warm and unhurried and surprising in the way their conversations always were. But underneath all of it, something was ticking. She felt it on the drive home. Felt it through dinner and through the 3 emails she finally answered and through the glass of wine she had sitting on her couch, watching nothing in particular on her laptop. The ticking quality of a thing that is changing whether you're ready for it or not. The feeling of standing on ground that was solid yesterday and is something else today. She didn't know yet what Jitae's world actually looked like. She would find out 7 days later in a way that would change everything she thought she understood, not just about him, but about the shape of her own life, and whether she was the kind of woman who could hold the weight of another person's truth without letting it unmake everything she'd fought to become. But that night, sitting in her South Side apartment with Chicago humming outside her window, and the wine going warm in her glass, and the feeling in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel in so long, it almost scared her. She thought about a man who hadn't slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in 3 years, and whose hands were gentle when he thought they needed to be. And she thought, this is either the best thing that has happened to me in years, or it is the thing that undoes me entirely. She didn't know which. She thought about it a long time before she finally fell asleep. She found out on a Wednesday, which was the kind of day that had no particular weight to it until it did. It started with a name. She'd been at her desk at the Cook County Family Services office, working through a stack of case files that had been waiting since Monday, when her coworker Daniel, 32, loud laugh, The kind of man who processed every emotion through sports metaphors, dropped a newspaper on the edge of her desk, the way people drop things when they want you to look at something without admitting they want you to look at it. "You know anybody on the north side?" he said, not really asking. She looked at the paper. Metro section, bottom fold. A photograph of a building she didn't recognize. Industrial, something near the waterfront, with police tape across the entrance and 2 squad cars visible at the edge of the frame. The headline read, "Federal Task Force expands probe into North Side syndicate operations." She read the first paragraph. The name was in the 3rd sentence. Kang Ji-tae, identified by federal investigators as the head of a Korean-origin organized crime network operating across Chicago's North Side and extending into distribution networks in 3 neighboring states, had not been charged but was described as a person of significant interest in an ongoing... She stopped reading. Daniel was still standing at the edge of her desk. "Some serious stuff," he said. "They've been watching that crew for years, apparently. Never quite enough to make it stick." Zuri said. She turned the paper face down. She went back to her case file. She did not look at her phone for the rest of the afternoon. At home that night, she sat at her kitchen table for a long time without turning on the lights. The apartment went from gray to dark around her, and she didn't move, just sat with her hands flat on the table surface and let her thoughts do what they were going to do, which was run in large, ugly circles that covered the same ground repeatedly without resolution. She thought about every conversation. She cataloged them with the thoroughness of someone building a case, which was a habit she'd developed in social work and which served her badly in personal situations because it turned every memory into evidence of something. The way he'd said business without the kind. The way he'd said protecting it without flinching. The men at the gala who'd approached him with their careful postures and their lowered voices and their deference that wasn't social. "You should make your own judgment," he'd said. She had liked that. She had respected it. She had filed it under honesty and set it beside all the other things she'd collected about him over the past 4 weeks, and called it a picture of who he was. She had not asked the obvious follow-up question. That was on her. She knew that. She was 28 years old and she worked in family services, and she had sat across from enough people in enough difficult rooms to know that what someone doesn't tell you is often the most important information they're giving you. And she had chosen not to ask because she hadn't wanted to know, which was a different thing entirely from not knowing. She sat in the dark for a long time. Then she picked up her phone. She typed, "I read the paper today." She stared at it. She sent it. 3 minutes passed. She watched the screen. Then the 3 dots appeared, and then they disappeared, and then they appeared again, and then they disappeared, and then his name was on her screen as a call. She let it ring once, twice. Then she picked up. "Where are you?" he said. His voice was different, stripped of the careful neutrality, something moving underneath it that she hadn't heard before. "Home." "I can come..." "No?" She pressed her palm flat against the table. "Tell me what's true." Silence. "Jitai, what did the article say?" "It said enough. Tell me what's true." Another silence, longer this time, and she heard him breathe, which was the first time she'd ever heard him breathe in a way that suggested effort. "What I told you about business, I told you the honest version of it. The honest version. I told you there were parts of it I was protecting. You told me I should make my own judgment." "Yes." "You gave me that judgment without the information to make it." "I know." She closed her eyes. "Are you..." She stopped. Rebuilt. Is what they're describing true? The silence this time was different from the others. Not evasive, not calculating, just heavy with the weight of a decision being made in real time. She heard traffic somewhere near wherever he was. A door. Wind. "Yes," he said. It landed exactly the way she'd known it would, and exactly the way she hadn't been prepared for anyway. "Okay," she said. "Zuri, I need tonight," she said. "Just tonight." She hung up. She sat in the dark for another hour. Then she got up and washed the dishes that had been in her sink since Sunday, and she dried them, and she put them away, and she stood at her kitchen window and looked at the city lights below, and let herself feel everything she'd been holding since she read the 3rd sentence of that article, which was a lot of things in rapid, unsorted sequence. Betrayal and something that was not quite betrayal. Anger and something that was not quite anger. And underneath all of it, stubborn and unwanted, the thing she'd been trying to keep at a careful distance for 4 weeks. which was the fact that she had started to depend on him. Not in the soft, romantic way, in the bone-deep way. In the first person in a long time who talks to me like I'm worth the full attention way. And she hated that she had let that happen before she had all the information, hated that she had been so hungry for the feeling of being genuinely seen that she hadn't looked hard enough at who was doing the scene. She had been careful her whole life. She had been so careful. She called him back at 7 the next morning. "I'm not running," she said before he could speak. "But I need you to understand that I'm not the same person you talked to before last night. I'm asking different questions now." "Ask them." She'd written them down. She wasn't ashamed of that. She pulled the folded paper from her jeans pocket and flattened it on the table. "How many people answer to you directly?" A pause. 38. "How many have you ordered hurt?" Longer pause. "That's not a number I'm going to give you over the phone." "That's not a no." "No," he said. "It's not a no." She breathed through her nose. "Are you going to be arrested?" "Probably not. The task force has been building for 4 years and they haven't charged anyone at my level. They're looking for someone lower to turn." That's very calm for a person talking about a federal investigation. "I've known about it for 2 years." She set the paper down. "You've known for 2 years?" "Yes. And you started—" She stopped. "You started talking to me anyway." "I started talking to you because I wanted to." His voice was still stripped of the careful neutrality. "I knew what I was. I told you to make your own judgment. I told you there were parts I was protecting. I did not lie to you about anything you asked me directly. That is the most technical definition of honesty I have ever heard." "I know. Do you think that's enough?" "No." The word came fast and clean, no cushioning on it. "It's not enough. I'm telling you it's what I did, not that it was sufficient." She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. She had expected him to defend it harder. She had prepared, during her hour in the dark, for the argument she'd need to make against a defense, and he had taken the defense away, and she didn't know what to do with the space left behind. "I need to think," she said. "Take the time you need." "You say that like it's easy." "It's not easy." A pause. "But it's your time. It's yours to take." She took 5 days. In that time, she went to work and came home and went to work again. She called her friend Diane from graduate school, who lived in Atlanta now, and who had a gift for asking the exact question Zuri least wanted to answer. She went for 2 long runs along the lakefront in the cold, the kind of runs where you're not actually running for fitness, but for the feeling of moving through something difficult and arriving somewhere on the other side of it. She did not call Naomi. On the 5th evening, Jite sent a single text. Not a message, just a photograph. A paper lantern, one of the gold ones from the gala, sitting on what looked like a windowsill, city lights behind it. No caption. She stared at it for a long time. Then she called him. "I'm not going to pretend any of this is simple," she said when he picked up. "I'm not asking you to. I'm not going to pretend that I don't have serious concerns about what your life looks like. I know. But I also know that if I walk away from this right now, I'm going to spend a long time being angry at myself for using it as an excuse." She paused. "I've done that before. Use the first available reason to go before someone could leave first. I'm trying not to do that anymore." He was quiet. "Are you currently endangering people who don't deserve to be endangered?" she said. "Define deserve." "Jitai. The people in my network chose it," he said carefully. "The work I do is violent in ways I'm not going to minimize to make you more comfortable. People outside my network aren't targeted. I don't work in product that destroys communities. I've spent the last 4 years moving toward operations that are—" He paused. "Cleaner." "Cleaner?" "Yes." That word is doing a lot of work in that sentence. "I know that too." She exhaled. "I need you to not lie to me. Ever. About anything I ask directly." "Yes. And I need you to understand that I'm going in with open eyes, which means if something changes, if something happens that I can't live with, I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to leave." "I understand." "Do you?" "Zuri." His voice was low and even. "I've never asked anyone to stay before. I'm not going to make it harder for you to leave." She sat with that for a moment. Then, "That lantern in the photograph, where did you get it?" "I went back to the community center." "Why?" "I wanted something from that night." A pause that was smaller than his other pauses. "Before you knew." When you were just a woman who asked me too many personal questions and told me something true about herself. She closed her eyes. That's... She stopped. I know, he said quietly. The weeks that followed moved differently than the weeks before. Not slower or faster, just different in texture, denser, the way weather changes before a storm. Not by becoming more dramatic, but by becoming more itself. They were still careful with each other, still circling in the way that people do when they both understand that something real is at stake, and neither can afford to be careless with it. But there was no pretense now. She knew what she knew, and he knew she knew. And some of the energy that had gone into not asking and not answering had been redistributed into something more direct. He took her to dinner at a restaurant in Pilsen on a Thursday in November. Low lights, small tables, a place that didn't care who you were or weren't, and across a bowl of something that tasted like it had been cooking since morning. She watched him talk about the legitimate side of what he ran. A property development operation on the north side, 2 restaurants, a security consulting firm. Real operations, real employees, real revenue. The other side funded them in the early years. Now they sustained themselves. How close is close? She asked. To legitimate. To being out. He looked at his bowl. Not close enough. He looked up. Closer than 3 years ago. Is that the truth or the version that makes me feel better? I don't give you versions that make you feel better, he said flatly. You told me not to. She had. She had asked him specifically not to, because she'd spent years surrounded by people who gave her comfortable versions of truth. Her mother before she died, Naomi always, her department head who called impossible workloads challenging opportunities. And she had decided she would rather have the hard thing clearly than the easy thing wrapped in something it wasn't. She told him that once. He hadn't forgotten. Closer than 3 years ago, she said. Okay, it wasn't enough. She knew that. She knew that closer than 3 years ago was not the same as safe or clear or done. And she knew that she was making a choice every day to be in something that carried weight she couldn't fully calculate. But she had also spent 28 years making the safe choice. The quiet choice. The choice that protected her from the full cost of wanting something. And she had arrived at the present moment without much to show for all that protection, except a very well-developed talent for making herself smaller. She was done making herself smaller. She told him that on a night in late November, walking through Millennium Park in a cold that had finally become the genuine article, the kind of cold that stripped everything down to what it actually was. I've spent my whole life waiting for permission to take up space, she said. Permission from Naomi. From my mother before she died. From every room I walked into where I could feel people deciding whether I was worth the full version of their attention. She had her hands in her pockets, and her breath was coming out in small clouds ahead of her. I'm done waiting for permission. Jite walked beside her. He didn't speak immediately, and she had learned by now that his silences were a form of listening rather than a form of distance. The boutique, he said finally. Yeah. What would you have said to her if you'd said something? She thought about it. Really thought about it. Not the polished version she sometimes rehearsed in her head on bad nights, but the actual raw version, the version with the anger still in it. I would have said, the next time you laugh at me in public, I will walk out and I will not come back. She paused, and I would have meant it. Have you said it to her yet? No? Why not? She knew why. She'd known why for years. Because she'd cry, and then I'd comfort her. And then somehow it would be about her feelings instead of about what she did. He looked at her. That's not a reason. That's a pattern. I know what it is. You told me you were done waiting for permission. She looked at him. That includes from her, he said. She didn't answer, but she heard it land in the way things land when they're true and you've been avoiding them. Not like an attack, but like a key turning in a lock you didn't know was there. They kept walking. The call from Naomi came 2 weeks later at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. Zuri was already in bed, half asleep, when her screen lit up with her sister's name, and she answered with the particular alertness of someone who has learned that late calls rarely mean good news. I need you, Naomi said. Her voice had the specific quality of someone who has been crying recently and stopped just long enough to make the call. Marcus and I had a fight. A real one. Zuri sat up. What kind of fight? The kind where things get said. A pause. I'm at the apartment alone. Can you come? She should have gone. That was the pull. The deep muscle memory pull of 17 years of being the sister who came when called, who showed up and smoothed things over and absorbed whatever needed absorbing so that Naomi's world could continue running at the temperature Naomi preferred. She sat in the dark with the phone against her ear. "Naomi," she said carefully, "what did you fight about?" "It doesn't matter. Tell me what you fought about." A pause. "He said I put too much pressure on you. That I treat you—" She stopped. "That I don't treat you the way I should. He said I've been doing it for years and he doesn't want someone like that around our kids someday." Zuri's hand tightened on the phone. "He's wrong," Naomi said quickly. "I mean, I know I can be. Sometimes I'm not. But it's not like what he's saying. He made it sound like I was—" "What did he say specifically?" Silence. "Naomi. He said I treat you like a punchline." Her voice had gone flat. "Those were his words. I treat you like a punchline, and I've been doing it so long I don't even see it anymore." The apartment was very quiet. "He's right," Zuri said. Nothing on the other end of the line. Then, "What?" "He's right." She said it steadily, without heat, which was harder than saying it with heat would have been. "You do. You have been. For a long time." "Zuri, I don't do that on purpose. I know you don't think you do. That's the part that's hardest to explain to you." She paused. "The boutique. 3 weeks ago. Do you remember what you did?" A long silence. "You laughed," Zuri said, "in front of everyone. And then you acted like it didn't happen, and I went along with it because I always go along with it. And then in the car you asked me if I was upset, and I said no because that's what I always say." "It wasn't," Naomi started. "If it wasn't a big deal, why do I still think about it?" Her voice stayed level. "Why do I still think about it the way I think about every other time? The birthday party when I was 12, the Thanksgiving at Aunt Renee's, every time we were in a room full of people and you needed something to be funny, and I was the available option." The silence on the other end had a different quality now. "I'm not calling to destroy you," Zuri said. "I love you. You're my sister. But I'm not coming over tonight to make you feel better about what Marcus said, because what Marcus said is true, and I need you to sit with that instead of having me take it away from you." The line was quiet for a long time. Then Naomi said in a voice she almost didn't recognize, "I didn't know you felt that way." "You didn't ask." Another silence. "I have to go," Zuri said. "I'll call you tomorrow. But I need you to hear what I said tonight and not call me back until you've actually heard it." She hung up. She sat in the dark for a long time after, the phone in her lap and the city outside her window, and the feeling in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but something that lived between the two. The feeling of having finally said the thing, and of not knowing yet what it cost, and of knowing that the cost was going to be real regardless of whether it was worth it. She texted Jitai. "I said it." He responded in under a minute. "How do you feel?" She looked at the question for a long time. "Like I just kicked down a door I've been leaning against my whole life," she wrote back. "And I don't know yet what's on the other side." His response came slowly, like he was choosing carefully. "That's how it's supposed to feel," he wrote. "It means it was real." She read it twice. Then she turned off her phone and lay back in the dark and let the feeling be what it was without trying to manage it, which was new for her, and which felt like standing on the edge of something very high and choosing, for the first time, not to step back. 3 days later, when 2 of Jitai's men were followed from a meeting on the near north side, and a black sedan slowed outside Zuri's building at 2 in the morning for 45 seconds before it pulled away without stopping, Jitai called her at 2:17 in the morning, and his voice had none of the careful neutrality left in it at all. "I need you to listen to me exactly," he said. She was already awake. She'd been awake since she heard the engine idle beneath her window, some instinct she didn't have a name for pulling her up from sleep before she understood why. "I'm listening," she said. "Don't go outside tonight. Don't answer the door for anyone you don't know. I'm sending someone to your building in 20 minutes. His name is Park Sung-ho. He's going to be in the lobby, and if you need anything before morning, you call him directly, not me." She was standing at her window with the lights off, looking down at the empty street. "Jitai? What's happening?" "Something I should have managed better. I'm handling it." "That is not an answer." "Zuri." His voice cut through. "I need you to trust me for the next 8 hours. When it's morning and I know more, I will tell you everything I know. But right now, I need you to stay inside and not ask me questions I can't answer without stopping what I'm doing." She looked at the empty street below. The sedan was gone. The streetlights threw their flat orange light across the pavement, and nothing moved. 8 hours, she said. 8 hours. She didn't sleep again. Park Sung-ho was exactly what Ji-tae had sent him to be. A quiet, solid man in his late 20s who sat in the lobby of her building on an uncomfortable chair near the mailboxes and did not speak unless spoken to, and radiated a kind of stillness that was not peaceful but professional. She came downstairs at 6 in the morning in her coat and handed him a cup of coffee from her kitchen without saying anything. He took it. He nodded once. Ji-tae called at 7:40. A rival organization has been watching my operations for 3 months, he said. No preamble, no easing in. He'd promised her everything he knew, and he was delivering it at the same temperature he'd deliver a weather report. They identified you 6 weeks ago. The car last night was surveillance. They were confirming the address. She sat at her kitchen table. They were confirming my address. Yes. Why? Because in their calculation, you are the fastest way to reach me. He paused. They're not wrong about that. She pressed her thumbnail into the wood grain of the table. What do they want? Territory. There are 3 distribution corridors on the northwest side that my network controls. They've been trying to negotiate for 2 years. I haven't moved. His voice was even, but she could hear the thing underneath it now. Not fear exactly, but the specific quality of a man who has been in control his entire adult life and is watching the edges of that control develop a shape he doesn't like. This is a pressure tactic. They think if they can get to you, they can move me. Can they? A silence that was its own kind of answer. Ji-tae. They miscalculated what it would make me do, he said, which was not the same thing as saying no. She looked out her kitchen window at the November sky, white and flat, the kind of sky that absorbed everything and reflected nothing back. She thought about Park Sung-ho in the lobby with his cup of coffee. She thought about the sedan idling under her window for 45 seconds. She thought about 6 weeks. 6 weeks that she had spent choosing to be in this, eyes open, making the adult decision every day to stay, and the entire time someone else had already been making decisions about her without her knowledge or consent. You knew they'd identified me, she said. The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. She counted. I suspected, he said. 3 weeks ago. I wasn't certain. 3 weeks ago. She heard her own voice go flat and quiet, which was what her voice did when she was at the far edge of something. You suspected 3 weeks ago. I was managing it. You were managing it. She stood up from the table. Ji-tae, I told you the one thing I needed from you was not to lie by omission. I said it specifically. I said anything I ask you directly. But I didn't ask about this because I didn't know to ask, and you knew that, and you made a choice about what I got to know. I was trying to protect. Don't. The word came out sharp and she let it. Don't tell me you were protecting me. You were controlling the information. That is not the same thing, and you know it. He didn't answer. I have a man I don't know sitting in my lobby, she said. My address is in the hands of people who want to use me against you. And I found out about it because a car sat outside my window at 2 in the morning, not because you told me. She stopped, breathed. What else don't I know? Another silence. Ji-tae, what else? There's a meeting happening tonight, he said, between my top lieutenants and the people I've identified as the threat. I'm trying to resolve this without it escalating further. And if it escalates further, it won't. You don't know that. No, he said, I don't. She stood at her window a long time after the call ended, not moving, her phone in her hand and the city laid out below her in its indifferent mourning. She felt something shifting in her chest that she didn't want to examine too closely yet, a structural thing, the feeling of weight redistributing to compensate for something that had given way. She had known what she was walking into. She had told herself that. She had been very clear with herself that she was walking into something with weight she couldn't fully calculate, and she had chosen it anyway. She had not calculated for this. She went to work. She did not know what else to do with herself, and sitting in her apartment with Park Sung-ho in the lobby felt like waiting for something she'd been told not to think about. So she went to the office and she worked her cases, and she answered her emails, and she ate a sandwich at her desk at noon, and at 2:15 in the afternoon she was in the middle of a phone call with a school counselor in Englewood when her desk phone rang with the office's front desk extension. She finished the call. Then she picked up the desk line. There's a woman here to see you. the front desk said. She doesn't have an appointment. She says it's personal. Name? A pause. The front desk person, whose name was Robert and who had worked the desk for 11 years and was unflappable about most things, sounded slightly uncertain. She said to tell you, Madame Kang. Zuri set down her pen. Tell her I'll be out in 5 minutes, she said. She took 10. She used them to sit at her desk and understand what was happening, which was that Jitae's mother had found her place of employment and come to it in person, which meant the woman had resources Zuri had not thought about, and also a level of intent that made a scheduled appointment unnecessary. She walked out to the waiting area. Madame Kang was not what she had constructed in her imagination, which said something about the distance between the stories she told herself and the reality they were standing in. She was small, 5'2" at most, in her late 60s, with the kind of posture that belongs to people who've never permitted themselves the luxury of slouching, wearing a dark coat that was expensive in the way that didn't need to announce itself. Her hair was silver and pulled back. Her face was composed in exactly the way her son's face was composed, the same default neutrality, except where Jitae's neutrality had cracks in it now when he looked at Zuri, his mother's had none. She was looking at Zuri the way someone looks at a problem they've been thinking about for a long time and are now seeing in person for the first time. Ms. Bennett, she said. Her English was precise, slightly formal, the English of someone who learned it as a discipline rather than a first language. Ms. Kang, Zuri said, would you like to sit? I won't be long. She didn't look at the chairs. I came to speak plainly. My son tells me you prefer plainness. He's right about that. Then I'll be plain. She folded her hands in front of her, a gesture that was not aggressive but was absolute. My son has built something over 20 years that requires him to be at all times without vulnerability. You understand what I mean by that? I understand what you mean. A woman in his life, a woman he cares about in the way he cares about you, becomes a surface through which he can be reached. She said it without apology, as a structural fact. Last night confirmed that. The people who are watching him have identified you. You understand that what happened last night was only the beginning of what they'll attempt. I understand that. Do you? It wasn't a question exactly. Ms. Bennett, I have watched 3 men in my life build what my son has built. I watched what happened to the people they loved who stayed beside them. She paused. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to tell you what I have seen with my own eyes, which is that love is not sufficient protection against the kind of danger my son's life carries. Zuri looked at her for a long moment. Does Jitae know you're here? She said. Something moved in Madame Kang's expression, the first movement she'd seen in it. No. Does he know you intended to come? No. Zuri nodded slowly. So you're here without his knowledge to tell me that I'm a liability and that the right thing, the thing that would protect him, is for me to remove myself from the equation. Madame Kang didn't answer, which was its own answer. I appreciate the plainness, Zuri said. Let me be plain back. She held the older woman's gaze and kept her voice even. I hear what you're telling me. I'm not dismissing it. You're describing a real thing that I've been thinking about since 2 a.m. She paused. But what you're also telling me, whether you mean to or not, is that your son's safety depends on him not being allowed to love anything. And I don't think that's a life. I think that's a sentence. Madame Kang was very still. I think, Zuri continued carefully, that the people in Jitae's life who love him have been protecting him by making him smaller, by making him believe that the right strategy is to feel nothing for anyone. And I think that worked for a while, and I think it cost him things he hasn't finished calculating yet. She paused. With respect. The silence between them had a specific texture, not hostile, but taut. The silence of 2 people who have both said something real and are waiting to see what the other does with it. You're not what I expected, Madame Kang said finally. People say that. I expected someone who didn't understand what she was in. I understand it. Zuri looked at her steadily. I'm still standing here. Madame Kang looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, The men who came to your street last night, their leader's name is Cho Byung-soo. He ran operations in Seoul before he came to Chicago. He is not a man who makes 2 attempts. She straightened her coat. I'm telling you this not because I've changed my position. I'm telling you because if you are going to stay, you should know the name of what you're staying inside of. She left. Zuri stood in the waiting area of the Cook County Family Services office and listened to the door close and felt something cold move through her that was not quite fear, but was fear adjacent. The specific chill of a name being given to a thing that had previously been shapeless. Cho Byung-soo. She sat back down at her desk. She looked at the case file open in front of her. A 12-year-old in a foster placement that wasn't holding, a child in a situation too large for her, needing someone to see her clearly and act on what they saw. Zuri picked up her pen. She worked until feet. She didn't tell Ji-tae about his mother's visit that evening. She told herself it was because she needed to think it through first, which was partially true. The other part of the truth, the part she didn't look at directly, was that she wanted to watch him. The way he sat across from her at his kitchen table in the North Side apartment she'd been to 3 times now. The way he moved through his own space with the controlled efficiency of someone who'd trained himself to take up exactly the amount of room required, and no more. And she wanted to see if she could find the thing his mother was describing. The vulnerability, the surface through which he could be reached. She found it quickly. She'd always been able to find it, which was the thing she couldn't tell Madame Kang without it sounding like something it wasn't. She'd found it in the chrysanthemum tea he'd brought her at the gala, in the lantern on the windowsill, in the way he said her name when the careful neutrality slipped, which it did, consistently, specifically around her. She had found it, and she had understood it, and she had kept it carefully, the way you keep something that belongs to someone else. The question Madame Kang had put in the room was whether keeping it was an act of love or an act of damage. "You're somewhere else," Ji-tae said. She looked at him. He was watching her across the table with a cup of tea in both hands and his eyes steady on her face. "I'm here," she said. "You're thinking something you're deciding whether to tell me." She looked at him for a long moment. "Your mother came to my office today," she said. He went very still. She told him everything. The exact words, the posture, the coat, the name at the end. Cho Byung-soo. She delivered it in the same flat, complete way he delivered information to her, without softening or editorializing, and she watched his face go through something she hadn't seen on it before, which was the specific movement of a man encountering something that has bypassed all his defenses, because it came from a direction he didn't think to guard. When she finished, he set his cup down. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't apologize to me. Talk to her." She had no right. She had every right. She's your mother, and she's scared for you, and she did it in the wrong way. But she did it because she loves you. Zuri held his gaze. "Don't be angry at her for that. You don't get to be angry at people for loving you badly when they haven't been taught to do it any other way." Something cracked in his expression. She watched it happen and didn't look away from it, because she was done looking away from the hard things, because that was the decision she had made in the parking lot of a late-night diner 3 weeks ago, and the decision she had remade every day since then, and she was going to keep making it even when it cost her, because the alternative was going back to the version of herself who kept everything at a careful, maintained distance and called it self-preservation, when it was really just fear with better posture. "She's not wrong," he said finally, "about the danger. I know she's not wrong. Cho Byung-soo is—" He stopped. His jaw was tight. "He's not going to stop." "I know, say." "Zuri, I know." She leaned forward. "Ji-tae, I know. I've known since 2 in the morning. I've been sitting with it all day, and I'm still here." She paused. "But I need you to make me a promise." He waited. "Nothing else? No more things you're managing that I don't know about. No more assessments you're making on my behalf about what I can handle." She held his gaze. "If something is happening that involves me, even peripherally, even as a possibility, I need to know it when you know it, not after." "Yes," he said. "That's not— I need you to understand what I'm asking, not just agree to it." "I understand what you're asking." He looked at her steadily. "You're asking me to trust you with the full weight of what my life is, not the managed version, not the version I've decided you can carry." "Yes. I've never done that." "I know." His hands were still on the table. She could see the tension in them. The controlled, habitual tension of a man who'd spent his adult life keeping his grip tight on everything. "Yes," he said again, and this time it landed differently. Heavier. "Finn?" The panic attack happened 11 days later. She was in a department store on the Magnificent Mile. A purely ordinary errand, winter coat, the zipper on hers had given out, And she was in the women's section when two women near the fitting rooms began talking in the specific carrying tone of people who think they're being private and aren't. She couldn't make out all of it. She made out enough. She made out honestly, and some people in a laugh that had the same quality as Naomi's laugh in the boutique, the kind that was technically about something else and wasn't. It shouldn't have been enough to take her down. She knew that even as it was happening. She'd absorbed worse with less visible damage. She had a vocabulary for this. She had tools. But something about that day, the cumulative weight of the past 3 weeks, Madame Kang in the waiting room, the name Cho Byung-soo written on a piece of paper she'd folded and put in her coat pocket and hadn't been able to throw away, something had stripped away the usual buffer. She made it to the parking garage. She found her car. She sat down with her back against the rear tire, on the cold concrete floor, in the dim amber light of level 3, and her hands were shaking and her chest was doing the thing where it couldn't decide if it was supposed to expand or contract, and every breath came out jagged and insufficient, and she was alone in a parking garage in downtown Chicago having a panic attack over two women she didn't know, and she was so tired, suddenly, so bone-deep exhausted from carrying everything, from being careful, from knowing too much and being known too little. From the sedan under her window and the name in her pocket, and the doors she'd kicked down, and the other doors she still hadn't opened, and all of it at once, pressing down on the 3 square feet of concrete she was sitting on. She called Jitai without deciding to. Her hands did it while her brain was still somewhere else, and it rang twice and he picked up and said her name as a question, and she couldn't answer immediately because she was still trying to get her breath to behave, and she heard him say her name again, different this time, lower and more urgent, and she said, "I'm in the parking garage, Michigan and Chicago, level 3. "I'm coming," he said. "Stay on the phone." She stayed on the phone. He talked to her for the 11 minutes it took him to get there. Not about anything particular, not trying to fix it or assess it, just talking. The low, even timbre of his voice giving her something to organize her breathing around, telling her about the traffic on Michigan, about the parking structure entrance, about the color of the elevator doors on level 3. A running commentary that was purely about helping her locate herself in space and time. And it worked the way it worked when someone who understands a thing does it correctly, which is that it didn't solve anything, but it made the thing survivable until he arrived. She heard his footsteps on the concrete before she saw him, fast and deliberate, not running but close to it. And then he was there, crouching down to her level, his hands finding her face, his eyes steady on hers. "Hey," he said, "I've got you." She grabbed the front of his jacket with both fists and pressed her forehead against his shoulder and breathed, and he settled down onto the concrete floor beside her without hesitation or performance, his arms solid around her, and they sat like that on the cold floor of a parking garage under fluorescent lights with the distant sound of cars on levels below them. And he didn't say anything more because he had learned by now that she didn't need it fixed, she needed it witnessed, and he was witnessing it with everything he had. She didn't know how long they stayed on the floor. Long enough for her breathing to even out. Long enough for the shaking to stop in her hands and migrate somewhere deeper, somewhere internal, where it became the quieter trembling of a body coming down from a state of alarm. Long enough for the cold of the concrete to work its way through her coat and her jeans and settle into her bones. Jitai didn't move. He sat with his back against her car and his arm around her and his jaw against the top of her head, and he stayed exactly as still as she needed him to stay, which was something she hadn't known she needed until he did it. The specific gift of someone who understood that what a person in collapse needs is not to be guided out of it, but to be accompanied through it. When she finally straightened up, he looked at her face with that careful, complete attention and didn't say, "Are you okay?" because he could see she wasn't, and they had agreed not to ask each other questions with obvious answers. "I'm embarrassed," she said. "Don't be. I'm embarrassed that it was nothing. 2 women in a store. I handle worse than that before breakfast." "You handle worse than that while carrying everything else," he said. "That's different." She looked at her hands. The shaking had stopped, but she could still feel where it had been, a memory of instability in her fingers. "I'm so tired, Jitai." "I know. I don't mean today. I mean—" She stopped. "I know what you mean," he said. He drove her home. He stayed. He made her eat something. Eggs, toast, the kind of meal that doesn't require consideration, because consideration was the last thing she had capacity for. And he sat across from her at her kitchen table, and they didn't talk about Cho Byung-soo or Madame Kang or federal task forces or the piece of paper in her coat pocket with a name on it. They talked about nothing that mattered and everything that did, and somewhere around midnight she fell asleep on her couch, and he put a blanket over her and sat in the chair across the room, and she didn't know until morning that he'd stayed the whole night. That was the last quiet night for a long time. It started 3 days later with a fire. One of Jitai's restaurants on the north side, a Korean barbecue place that had been operating for 6 years, that employed 40 people, that had a waiting list on weekends, burned to the ground at 3 in the morning on a Thursday. The fire marshal called it electrical. Jitai's people knew it wasn't electrical within 2 hours. Then a warehouse in Humboldt Park, one of the legitimate ones, storage for the property development operation. Not burned, broken into, emptied, the inventory taken or destroyed with a methodical thoroughness that communicated something very specific. We know exactly what you have and where it is. Then Park Sung-ho called Zuri directly at 11 in the morning on a Friday with a voice that was professionally controlled and communicating alarm underneath the control. Ms. Bennett, you need to leave your building in the next 10 minutes. Don't pack. Take your phone, your keys, your wallet. Use the service exit on the south side of the building. I'll be at the corner of... What's happening? She said. Mr. Kang will explain. Please move now. She moved. She had her coat on and her bag over her shoulder, and she was through the service exit and into the gray December morning in 8 minutes, and Park Sung-ho was exactly where he said he'd be. And she was in the back of a black car she didn't recognize heading north before her brain had fully processed the sequence of actions her body had performed. Jitae called as the car crossed the river. Are you in the car? He said. Yes, talk. They put a man outside your building last night. Not surveillance this time. He was there from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., and he had a photograph of you. His voice was stripped entirely now. No neutrality, no management, just the flat, hard architecture of what he actually sounded like when everything else was removed. I'm not going to let them use you, but I need you somewhere that isn't your apartment. Where are you? Dealing with the warehouse situation. I'll be with you in 2 hours. Jitae, 2 hours, Zuri. Sung-ho is taking you somewhere safe. I need you to let him do that. She looked out the window at Chicago moving past. The river, the bridges, the buildings that had been there her whole life and would be there long after all of this, indifferent in the specific way that cities are indifferent, absorbing everything and explaining nothing. 2 hours, she said. The safe house was an apartment on the 13th floor of a building in Streeterville that looked like every other residential building in Streeterville. Lobby, elevator, hallway, door, except that the door had 3 locks, and the windows had glass that she suspected was not standard residential glass. And there were 2 men in the apartment who she'd never met who introduced themselves as Daniel and Ryu, and then positioned themselves near the door and the window, respectively, and became furniture. She sat on the couch with her phone in her lap. She called Naomi. It rang 4 times. Then, Zuri? It's the middle of the... I'm fine. I need you to know that I'm fine, and I need you to not be at your apartment tonight. Silence. Naomi. What is happening? Her sister's voice had changed, the sleepiness gone, replaced with something sharp and present that Zuri recognized as the version of Naomi that appeared in genuine emergencies, the version that didn't perform. It's complicated and I can't explain it right now. I need to know you're somewhere that isn't your apartment. Does this have to do with the man you're seeing? Naomi. Does it? Yes. A silence that was long enough to contain several different emotions moving through in sequence. Then, I'm going to Marcus's parents' house. They're in Oak Park. A pause. Are you safe? Right now? Yes. Zuri. Her sister's voice cracked on the word just slightly. Tell me you're safe. I'm safe. I'll call you when I can. She paused. Naomi. I meant what I said on the phone. About the boutique, about everything. I need you to know that wasn't anger. That was truth. I need you to sit with that. I have been, Naomi said, and something in her voice was different from every prior version of this conversation, quieter and more careful, like she was handling something she now understood to be breakable. I've been sitting with it. A pause. Go be safe. We'll talk when this is over. Yeah, Zuri said. We will. Jitae arrived at the apartment at 12:47 p.m. She knew it was him from the specific pattern of the knock, which she'd noticed he always used. 2, then 1, then 2. Without him ever explaining it, and without her ever asking, one of the many small private architectures they'd built without discussing them. He came through the door and she saw immediately that the 2 hours had been expensive. There was a cut above his left eyebrow, sealed with a butterfly strip that hadn't been applied by anyone with medical training. His coat had something on the right sleeve that she chose not to identify specifically. His eyes, when they found her across the room, had the quality of a man who has been managing multiple crises simultaneously and has located the one that matters most. He crossed the room to her in 6 steps and took her face in both hands and looked at her for a moment. Just looked, as if confirming something, and then let out a breath that she felt against her forehead. "You're okay," he said. "I'm okay. You're bleeding." "It's nothing. It's not nothing. It's your face." She pushed his hands down gently and made him sit on the couch, and she went to the bathroom and found a first aid kit under the sink with the reflexive thoroughness of a man who keeps first aid kits everywhere. And she came back and sat beside him and replaced the butterfly strip with one that would actually hold. He let her do it. He sat still under her hands and let her do it, which was not a small thing for him, and she knew it. "Tell me what's happening," she said. He told her. Cho Byung-soo had accelerated his timeline. The fire and the warehouse were opening moves, designed not to destroy, but to demonstrate knowledge. "I know what you have. I know where it is. I can reach any part of you at any time." The man outside her building was the escalation. "I can reach the parts that aren't business, too." The message was clear, and it was the same message it had been from the beginning, which was, "Give us the territory, or we'll take something else instead." "He's not going to stop at messages," Jitae said. His voice was flat and controlled, and she could feel the thing moving underneath it, the thing she'd heard the night of the car under her window, but louder now. "He's going to move. It's going to be soon." "How soon?" 48 hours, maybe less. She looked at him. "What are you going to do?" He met her eyes. "I'm going to end it." "Define end it." "I'm going to find him before he moves. And I'm going to make clear in terms he can't reinterpret that this city doesn't have room for both of us." He paused. "That's as specific as I can be right now." She looked at the butterfly strip above his eyebrow. She thought about everything she'd chosen and everything it had cost and everything it was about to cost. And she thought about Madame Kang in the waiting room saying love is not sufficient protection, and she thought about Park Sung-ho in the lobby with his cup of coffee, and she thought about the name folded in her coat pocket. "You told me you'd tell me everything," she said. "I'm telling you everything. Then tell me what end it actually means." He looked at her for a long moment. The controlled expression, the careful architecture of his face, she could see him deciding in real time to give her the thing he'd never given anyone. "It means I go to where he is," he said, "with enough men and enough leverage that the only options he has are to take what I offer or lose everything." His voice didn't change, but his eyes did. "And if he chooses to lose everything, I'm prepared to help him do that." She breathed. "Is there another way?" she said. "I've been looking for one for 3 months." He said it without defensiveness, as a factual accounting. "There isn't one that doesn't end with him trying this again in 6 months with more preparation." She nodded slowly. She looked at the floor, then she looked up at him. "Come back," she said. Something moved in his face. "That's what I'm asking," she said. "Whatever you have to do, come back from it." He reached over and took her hand. His grip was tight and warm, and she could feel his pulse in it, elevated, the pulse of a man who was holding himself at a specific controlled temperature because the alternative was too hot to manage. "Yes," he said. What happened in the next 18 hours moved in the fragmented way that genuine crises move, not in the continuous narrative of something remembered afterward, but in the staccato of it, each moment separated from the next by a gap where the ordinary texture of time used to be. Jitae left the apartment at 3 p.m. with 4 men she'd never met. He didn't say goodbye in those words. He said, "I'll call you in 2 hours," same as he always said, the same interval, the same promise. And she nodded and watched him go and then turned and looked at the apartment walls and the 2 men who were still furniture near the door and the window, and she thought, this is what it is. This is exactly what I said I could carry. Find out if you meant it. The 2-hour call didn't come. 3 hours passed. Then 4. Daniel and Ryu remained at their positions, and their faces communicated nothing, but she saw Daniel check his phone at the 4-hour mark with a microsecond of something in his eyes that he closed off before she could read it fully. "Tell me what you know," she said. "Ms. Bennett, don't." She stood up and faced him. "I'm not going to fall apart. I'm not going to do anything that makes your job harder. But I need to know what you know, and I need you to tell me right now." Daniel looked at her for a moment with the measuring look of someone assessing a claim being made about load-bearing capacity. Mr. Kang's team made contact with Cho's people at a shipping facility on the South Lakefront at approximately 1700 hours, he said. "There was a negotiation. It didn't hold." "What does that mean?" "It means it became something other than a negotiation." She sat down. We don't have confirmation of status yet." He held her gaze steadily. "No confirmation of negative outcome either. We're monitoring." She put both hands flat on her thighs and pressed down and breathed through her nose, and did what she'd done in the bridal boutique and the parking garage and every other moment when the feeling became too large for the space she had to put it. She folded it down, she held herself at the temperature required, she did not let it take her because she could not afford to be taken. She would not let the next few hours be defined by waiting. "I need a phone," she said. "Not mine. One of yours." Daniel and Ryu exchanged a look. "Give me a phone," she said. "I'm calling his mother." Madame Kang answered on the second ring, which told Zuri she'd been holding the phone. "He hasn't called," the older woman said before Zuri spoke. "I know." A silence. "Are you at home?" Zuri asked. "Yes." "I need you to tell me everything you know about the facility on the South Lakefront. Anything Jitai ever told you about it. Anything you know about Cho Byung-soo's operation there." She paused. "I know you came to my office to ask me to leave. I'm asking you to help me anyway." The silence on the other end was the longest silence she'd sat through all night. Then Madame Kang said, "There is a secondary entrance on the east side along the waterline. Jitai's men don't know it. Cho's people built it 2 years ago when they first started using the facility." Her voice was measured and precise and completely without hesitation, the voice of a woman who had been waiting to be useful and had been given the opening. "There is also a man inside Cho's organization, a logistics coordinator named Han Dai-jung. He has been passing information to my son for 8 months. If Jitai's primary approach failed, Han would have moved him through the eastern entrance." "Bamgen isamt. Why didn't Jitai tell me about Han?" "Because Han is the reason Jitai went tonight without more men. He trusted the intelligence Han provided about Cho's numbers at that facility." A pause. "The intelligence may have been compromised." The cold that moved through Zuri's chest was not fear this time. It was something harder than fear. The specific cold of understanding a situation clearly. "Han may have given Cho's people advance notice," she said. "That is what I believe. Does anyone else know this?" "Not yet. I have been trying to reach Jitai's lieutenant, a man named—" "Tell Daniel," Zuri said. "He's in the room with me. Tell him everything you just told me and let him move on it." She handed the phone to Daniel. She watched his face as he listened. She watched him move from furniture to something with entirely different properties. Sharp, immediate, the face of a man with actionable information and the infrastructure to use it. He was already moving toward Ryu while he talked, and Ryu was on his own phone, and the apartment that had been holding its breath for 4 hours suddenly had current running through it. Zuri stood in the middle of it and felt with perfect clarity that she had just changed the shape of what was happening. She didn't know yet if it was enough. She stood at the window and looked out at the South Lakefront, somewhere beyond the dark geometry of the city, where the lake and the sky met in a line you couldn't see, and she thought about a man who hadn't slept more than 4 hours in 3 years, and whose hands were gentle when they needed to be, and who had sat on a cold concrete floor in a parking garage because she'd needed him to. And she pressed one hand flat against the cold glass, and she waited. 40 minutes later, Daniel's phone rang. He picked up. He listened for 11 seconds. His face changed. He turned and looked at her across the room, and whatever he saw in her expression made him skip the version where he chose his words carefully. "They found him," he said. "He's alive. There was a confrontation inside the facility. 3 of Cho's men are down. Jitai he's on his way out now. He's injured, but he's conscious. He's asking for you." She was already reaching for her coat. The drive to the lakefront took 19 minutes. Daniel drove. Ryu sat in the passenger seat and said nothing. Zuri sat in the back and watched Chicago move past the window. The streets she'd grown up with, the overpass she'd driven under 1,000 times, the skyline that had always been the backdrop of her life, indifferent and permanent and entirely unaware of what was happening at its southern edge. and she kept both hands flat on her thighs the way she'd learned to do when she needed to stay in her body instead of ahead of it. She didn't pray. She had never been a woman who outsourced her fear to the open air and hoped something received it. Instead, she made calculations. She made them the same way she made them at work, in the difficult rooms with the children who needed someone to see them clearly. She assessed what she knew. She identified what she didn't know. She built the most accurate picture she could from available information, and then she moved toward it. What she knew, he was alive, he was conscious, he was asking for her. What she didn't know, everything else. She built toward alive and she held it, and she did not let herself build further than that until she had more information, because further than alive was a country she couldn't afford to visit yet. The facility was a long, low structure on the waterfront south of the museum campus. Industrial, the kind of building that existed in the space where the city's working infrastructure met the lake, where things were moved and stored and shipped, and nobody who lived in the nice neighborhoods thought very hard about. There were vehicles parked at crooked angles in the lot outside that told a story about how fast people had moved in the last hour. There were men she didn't know positioned at the entrance and the perimeter, and the cold off the lake was the sharpest cold she'd felt all winter, the kind that arrived with the smell of dark water. Park Sung-ho met her at the entrance. His face was the most expressive she'd seen it, which still wasn't very expressive, but the baseline had shifted enough that she could read it. He's inside. He's stable. He paused. He has a broken rib. Maybe two. And a laceration on his left arm that's been dressed. Another pause. He was held in a secondary room in the facility for approximately 3 hours before the team reached him. She breathed. He was held, she said. Yes. She moved past Sung-ho into the building. The interior of the facility smelled like industrial solvent and lake water, and something copper that she identified and set aside. The overhead lights were the harsh fluorescent kind that flattened everything and showed it accurately, which meant she could see the state of the main floor, the overturned equipment, the glass, the evidence of a confrontation that had been fast and serious and settled in the way that serious things settle, at a cost. And she could see Jitae's men moving through the space with the controlled efficiency of people conducting an aftermath, and she could see, at the far end of the floor, a door. Sung-ho opened it. Jitae was sitting on a crate with his back against the concrete wall and his legs stretched in front of him. His shirt had been cut away on the left side and replaced with a field dressing wrapped tight around his ribs and his upper arm. There was a bruise developing along the left side of his jaw that had the dark, immediate quality of something recent. His head was up, his eyes were open. When she came through the door, they found her face and did not move from it. She crossed the room to him and crouched down and put one hand against his jaw, carefully, on the side that wasn't bruised, and looked at him the same way he'd looked at her in the parking garage. Close, complete, confirming. "Hey," she said. "Hey." His voice was rough, lower than usual, the roughness of someone who had been through something that had worked on the voice the way hard things work on it. "You're going to tell me it's not as bad as it looks. It's not as bad as it looks. Is that true or the version that makes me feel better?" "Somewhere between both," he said. She exhaled. She moved her hand from his jaw to the back of his neck and pressed her forehead against his, and they stayed like that for a moment. Foreheads together, both of them breathing, the cold of the facility and the smell of the lake, and the sounds of the aftermath continuing on the other side of the door. And neither of them spoke because there wasn't language for the specific relief of "you're here, you're here, you're here" that did it justice. She pulled back and looked at his eyes, and they were clear, present, fully his. "Where is Cho Byung-soo?" she said. Something moved in his expression. "Detained. In a room in this building." He paused. "He's alive. He's going to stay alive. What happens to him next?" He stopped. "Tell me." "He's going to leave Chicago. Tonight. Everything he built here, the territory, the operation, the infrastructure, goes to people who can be reasoned with. He's going to disappear from this city and from any city I operate in, and if he comes back, the consequences will be final." He said it in the flat, factual tone that was his real voice when everything else was stripped away. "That's what he's agreed to." He agreed. Men agree to things when the alternative is made clear. She studied his face. "Is it over?" He held her gaze. "Yes." She had learned to read his yeses by now, the ones that were technically complete and simultaneously incomplete, and the ones that landed with their full weight in the room. This one landed. She felt it in the quality of the silence around it. Han Dae-jung, she said. His jaw tightened. You know about Han. Your mother told me, while you were in here. She watched him absorb that. She gave me the information about the eastern entrance. I gave it to Daniel. That's how they knew where to come in. He was very still. She was waiting by her phone, Zuri said. She was waiting the whole night. He looked at the floor. The bruise on his jaw had deepened in the time since she'd arrived, and she could see the effort it cost him to sit straight, the shallow, controlled breathing of someone managing rib pain, measured and deliberate, each breath a small decision. Han, she said again. Han made a choice, he said. He'll live with it. He looked up. He's not here. He was gone before we arrived, which means he knew we were coming, which means he'd already run. His voice was even. He can keep running. She understood what he was choosing not to do with that, and she understood what it meant that he was choosing it. The old version, the version his father had built, would not have left Han Dae-jung in a position to run. The fact that he did said something about the version he was becoming, the version that was closer than 3 years ago, moving in increments towards something she couldn't yet see the full shape of, but believed the direction of. That was what she had. Direction. Sometimes that was enough. She sat down on the concrete floor beside the crate, her back against the wall like his, their shoulders touching, and she looked at the opposite wall, and he looked at it too. And outside the door, the sounds of the aftermath continued, and the lake shifted and turned in the dark beyond the facility walls, and neither of them needed to say anything for a long time. Your mother, he said finally. Yeah. I need to call her. You need to call her, and then you need to sit with her and actually talk to her, Zuri said. Not the managed version, the real version. He was quiet. She loves you in the wrong way sometimes, she said. But she loves you, and she sat by her phone all night and gave me everything she knew the second I asked. She paused. That's not nothing. No, he said quietly. It's not. They kept him at the facility for another 2 hours, long enough for the man Sung-ho had called, a doctor who made house calls without documentation, to look at the ribs and the laceration and confirm what the field dressing had already established. 2 cracked ribs, not broken. The arm would need stitches, real ones, which the doctor provided on site with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this in worse conditions. Zuri held Jitai's hand while the stitches went in. Not because he needed her to, because she needed to. He noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He held her hand back. 3 days later, Naomi came. Zuri hadn't asked her to. She'd called her sister the morning after the facility to tell her it was over and she was safe. And Naomi had said, okay, and I'm glad. And then 3 days later, she knocked on Zuri's apartment door at 10 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee from the place on the corner that Zuri had been going to since college. And Zuri opened the door and looked at her sister and saw something in her face that she hadn't seen there in a long time, which was uncertainty. Not performed uncertainty. Real uncertainty. The face of someone who doesn't know if they're welcome and has come anyway. Zuri opened the door wider and let her in. They sat at the kitchen table with their coffees, and Naomi looked at the apartment. The coat on the hook by the door that wasn't Zuri's, the 2 cups on the dish rack, the small specific evidence of another life having begun to leave its mark on this space. And she looked at Zuri and she said, "Tell me about him." Zuri looked at her sister. She looked for the angle, the place where the interest shaded into competition or condescension or the reflexive diminishment that had been Naomi's mode for so long, it had become ambient, part of the background of every interaction, like a frequency you stop consciously hearing after a while. She couldn't find it. "What do you want to know?" Zuri said. "Everything." Naomi wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Start at the beginning." So she did. She told it straight. The boutique, the gala, the conversations that had stretched past midnight, the newspaper, the late call about the sedan, Madame Kang in the waiting room, the parking garage, the facility. She told it the way she'd learned to tell things in the last 3 months, which was completely without managing down the parts she thought the listener couldn't handle, because she'd decided the people who couldn't handle the full version of her life were not the people she could afford to spend the full version of her life with. Naomi listened without interrupting. When Zuri finished, Naomi was quiet for a long time, both hands still around her coffee cup, looking at the table. Then she looked up. "I owe you something," she said. "Naomi." "Let me say it." She held Zuri's gaze. I owe you 20 years of something I don't have a good word for. I told myself it was teasing, and I told myself it was just how we were. And I told myself you knew I loved you, so the way I acted didn't count against it. Omi bis paused. Marcus told me it did count, and I argued with him, and then I sat with it, and Her voice had gone careful, the way you carry something that's fragile because you've already broken it once. I thought about how many times I made you small in front of people, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. It kept coming. Zuri didn't say anything. The boutique, Naomi said. I knew when I laughed. I knew in the moment that it landed wrong. And I covered it over because covering it over was easier than, she stopped, than seeing what I'd done. Why? Zuri said. Not with anger. She genuinely wanted to know. Naomi looked at the table. Because you've always had something I didn't know how to explain. People trust you, not the way they trust me, not because you're pretty or polished or whatever. She shook her head. People tell you real things. They give you the actual weight of themselves. And she exhaled. I learned to get attention by being the one who was seen. You learned to get love by being the one who truly saw. And somewhere along the way, I decided that made you competition instead of my sister. The apartment was quiet. Outside, Chicago ran its noise, traffic, wind, the city doing what it always did. That's a very honest thing to say, Zuri said. Marcus helped. A small, raw attempt at humor that didn't quite land, but was genuine. He's a good man. He is, Naomi looked up. So is yours, from what you've told me. She paused. Different kind of good. Yeah, Zuri said, different kind. They sat with their coffees for another hour, and it wasn't fixed. Zuri understood that years of something don't dissolve in a morning over coffee. That what Naomi had said was a beginning and not a conclusion. That the work of rebuilding something that had been used badly for a long time is slow and unglamorous, and requires both people to keep showing up for it. But it was real. It was the realest conversation they'd had since they were children, before the patterns had fully calcified. Back when they were still just two people who loved each other without the architecture of damage between them. That was enough for a Tuesday morning. Jitai called his mother that same evening. Zuri was in the other room when it happened, not intending to listen, but the apartment was not large and his voice carried, not the words but the quality of it, which was different from every other phone call she'd heard him make. Lower, less constructed. The voice of someone who had taken the managed version down and left it somewhere and was speaking from the place underneath it. The call lasted 40 minutes. When he came back into the room, he sat beside her on the couch, and she looked at his face, which had the quality of something cleared, not resolved, not easy, but cleared, the way a room feels after you've finally opened all the windows. How was it? She said. Hard. Good hard or bad hard? He thought about it. The kind of hard that means it was overdue. She nodded. She asked about you, he said. What did you tell her? He looked at her. I told her she'd have to ask you herself. A pause. She wants to have dinner, if you're willing. Zuri thought about the woman who had come to her office in her expensive coat and her composed expression and her fear that had disguised itself as strategy. She thought about the phone call in the dark apartment, the voice that said he is alive with the specific quality of someone who had been holding a breath for hours. Tell her yes, she said. Try it. The dinner was 6 weeks later, at a restaurant on the north side that Madame Kang chose. Quiet, good lighting, the kind of place where conversations had weight because the room respected them. Madame Kang arrived before them and was seated at the table when they walked in, and she stood when she saw them, and there was a moment, brief, loaded, the moment when the three of them were standing in the middle of a restaurant, and all the previous versions of their interactions were in the room with them. And then Madame Kang looked at Zuri and said, I understand you are the reason my son is sitting at this table. He's the reason your son is sitting at this table, Zuri said. I just passed along some information. Something shifted in Madame Kang's expression, the same microsecond cracking she'd seen in Jitae's expression in the early weeks. The same structural thing, the face of someone encountering something they hadn't expected. Sit, Madame Kang said, and then, with the careful deliberateness of someone using a muscle they'd let atrophy, please. They ate for 3 hours. It was not easy in the way that things achieved by performance can be easy. There were silences that needed navigating and questions that landed harder than intended. And one moment, over the second course, when Madame Kang asked Zuri about her mother and Zuri answered honestly, and Madame Kang was quiet for a long time after, in a way that communicated something she wasn't yet practiced enough at this to say out loud. But Jitae sat between them like a man who had decided to stop being the buffer and start being the bridge. And Zuri watched him do it, watched him speak to his mother without the managed version, answer her questions without the distance, offer her the real version of his current life in increments that were small but continuous and genuine. And she thought, there it is. There's the thing that was always available and was never allowed. By the end of the evening, Madame Kang had told 3 stories from Jitai's childhood that he had clearly never intended for Zuri to hear, and Zuri had laughed at all 3 of them. And Jitai had looked at both women across the table with the expression of a man discovering that the specific kind of outnumbered he was finding himself in was not actually a threat. In the car on the way home, Zuri said, "She's formidable." "Yes, I like her." He looked at her. "I mean it," she said. "She's terrifying, and she came to my office without telling you, and she scared me significantly." "I also like her." She paused. "The 2 things coexist." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "She told me after you left her that day, after the office, that you were the first person she'd met in years who didn't want anything from her. That's not true. I wanted her help. She said you asked for help, not favor. She said those are different things." He looked at the road ahead. "I think she's right." Except winter moved toward spring the way Chicago winter always did. Slowly, reluctantly, giving ground one gray degree at a time before finally conceding. Jitae restructured things. Not overnight, not cleanly, because nothing built over 20 years dismantles cleanly. And she wasn't naive enough to believe the words legitimate transition contained no complexity or cost. There were men who left his organization and men who stayed. There were operations that wound down and operations that expanded to fill the space. There were conversations with lawyers and accountants and people she didn't meet and wouldn't ask about. And there was a version of Jitai that she saw in those months that was not quite the version from the gala or the riverside walks or the kitchen table at midnight. More pressured, more drawn, carrying the specific exhaustion of someone rebuilding a structure while still living inside it. She gave him the space it required. She also didn't disappear into the space. She was there at the kitchen table when he came home late. She was there on the weekends when the pressure lifted enough for them to walk by the lake and talk about things that had nothing to do with any of it. She was there when he woke up at 3 in the morning and lay in the dark, and she put her hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat slow, and she said nothing, and he said nothing, and that was enough. He slept 5 hours now. Regularly. He'd stopped counting. She noticed. She didn't make anything of it. She just noticed. And it sat in the quiet part of her chest where she kept the things that mattered most, alongside the gold lantern photograph and the feel of his hand in a parking garage and the knowledge that she had been seen, fully, completely, without reduction, by someone who understood the full weight of what that meant. In April, Naomi called her on a Thursday evening. "I need you to come shopping with me," she said. Zuri recognized the request and what it was asking her to carry, and she was quiet for a moment. "Not for the wedding," Naomi said quickly. "For me. Just, I want to find something for myself, and I want you there." A pause, and then, quietly, "I want to actually be with you, not perform being with you." Zuri closed her eyes. "Saturday morning," she said. "I'll pick you up." They went to a boutique on the north side. Not Area Bridal, not Michigan Avenue, a smaller place with no champagne flutes, and no Daphne and no pedestal, just racks of clothes in a well-lit room. Naomi tried on things and asked Zuri's actual opinion, and Zuri gave it, honestly. And when Naomi held up a dress that didn't suit her, and Zuri said, "Not that one," and Naomi looked briefly disappointed before laughing and putting it back. Zuri felt the specific quality of that laugh, a laugh between equals, at a situation, not at a person. And she understood that something had changed in a way that was small and would have looked insignificant to anyone watching, but was, for the two of them, a kind of crossing. Naomi bought a red coat. "You should try something," Naomi said near the end. Zuri looked at the racks. "That green one," Naomi said, pointing. "It's your color." Zuri took it off the rack and went to the fitting room. She put it on. She looked at herself in the mirror. The full mirror, in the full light, without the background noise of other people's laughter, or the sound of her own interior voice running its familiar inventory of everything insufficient. She looked. The dress fit. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not in vanity, but in the particular stillness of someone discovering that a thing they've avoided for a long time, a mirror, a room, a version of themselves, has become, without their quite noticing when, safe. She bought the green dress. The rooftop was Jitai's idea, or it had been his idea in the way that things become ideas between two people who have been paying close attention to each other long enough that the line between one person's idea and the other's blurs into something shared. He'd mentioned once that there was a building on the near north side with access to the roof and a view of the city that he'd never shown anyone, and she had said someday and he had said name the day, and somehow the day named itself, the way the right things do, without being forced. It was a Saturday in late May. The weather had finally done what Chicago weather does in late May when it decides to cooperate, which is to arrive at exactly the temperature that makes you forgive it for everything that came before. The sky was the deep dark blue of 9 o'clock, with the city lit below it in layers, the near lights orange and white, the far lights dissolving into haze, the lake a flat dark mirror at the edge of everything. Jitai had set up 2 chairs and a table and brought food from one of his restaurants. Simple things, things that meant something by now. The small vocabulary of a shared life in its early construction. They ate. They talked. At some point, the talking stopped in the way that conversations between people who are genuinely comfortable with each other stop. Not running out of things to say, but choosing silence because silence is also a form of it. Jitai was looking at the city. She was looking at him. He turned and caught her looking and didn't look away, and she didn't look away. And between them in the warm May dark was the full accumulated weight of everything. The bridal boutique and the chrysanthemum tea, and the newspaper and the parking garage and the facility and the stitches and the dinner with his mother and the green dress and the 5 hours of sleep. All of it present, none of it resolved into something clean or simple, all of it real. I used to sit in rooms full of people, he said, and calculate every variable, every threat, every angle. He looked at the city. I couldn't sit still. I had to be managing something or I felt, he paused, exposed. And now, she said. He looked at her. Now, he said, I can sit on a rooftop in the middle of this city, and I don't need to be managing anything. She looked at him for a long moment. That's not weakness, she said. I know. You know now. You didn't before. No, he said. I didn't before. She reached across the small table and put her hand over his, and his fingers turned and held hers, and they sat like that in the warm dark with the city spread below them in every direction. And she thought about the woman who had stood in a boutique dressing room 8 months ago and breathed through her nose and folded herself smaller. And she thought about how far that woman had walked from that dressing room, and how little of the distance had been about arriving somewhere, and how much of it had been about refusing, finally, and at some cost, to stay where she'd been. She had refused to stay small. He had refused to stay hollow. Those were the choices. Not the dramatic ones. Not the ones in parking garages and shipping facilities. Not the ones in front of audiences or under fluorescent lights. The small daily choices made quietly, over and over. To tell the truth when lying would have been easier. To stay when leaving would have been safer. To let yourself be known by someone even when being known had always ended badly before. Chicago glittered below them without comment. Jitai squeezed her hand once. She squeezed back. The night was warm, and the city was loud, and below them 8 million people were living their lives at full volume, and above them the sky went dark all the way to the edge of everything visible, and in between, on a rooftop in May, 2 people who had been told in different ways by different voices their entire lives that they were too much or not enough, sat together in the particular piece of people who have stopped listening to those voices. Not because the voices stopped. They don't stop. But because somewhere between a bridal boutique and a parking garage and a cold concrete floor and a dinner table and a green dress and a city lit at night, they had found something louder. And they had chosen, every day, to listen to that instead.